You ready? Hello, I'm delighted to welcome you to this University of Birmingham Festival event, Research That Matters. My name, just check it's working, is Anne-Marie Glover, and I'm the Deputy Director of Education for the College of Social Sciences, and I'm the host of this event today. We have students and other guests joining us both in person and online. You're all incredibly welcome. And today is your chance to hear some of our staff talk about their important and impactful research, and you get to ask them questions about their work too. So welcome then to our panel of amazing researchers drawn from across the university. These are people undertaking research that really does matter. They're helping us to understand the impact of COVID, helping us understand the impacts of climate change on our vital infrastructure, exploring the fascinating world of dinosaurs, and developing our learning about the incredible human brain. I am an academic teaching and researching social work, relationships, and leadership, and I'm really keen to develop my knowledge and our knowledge too about these fascinating areas. We're very much looking forward to hearing from all of you. So each speaker will speak for around 7 or 8 minutes each, just giving us a taste of their work. And the session will be recorded so that we and others can listen again later on. And once we've heard from all speakers, you'll be able to ask questions via Slido. So you'll see the address posted there and the Slido code is displayed on screen. So do make a note of these. We'll keep putting the slide back up at the end of each speaker's talk, so you'll get a chance to look again if you didn't quite catch it this time. And you can post your questions during the sessions. You can also vote for and like other people's questions, and those will rise to the top of our list of questions. So we'll understand some of the things that you all really want to hear about. So without further ado, we'll hear from our first speaker, Dr. Kaylee Garthwaite from the College of Social Sciences.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Yeah, hi everyone. So my name's Kaylee. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Policy. So I'm really excited today to talk to you about the COVID Realities Research Programme, which I was a co-investigator on and worked on for 2 years. So COVID Realities was, there was a lot of strands to the project, but I'm going to talk in particular about the participatory research that we worked on over 2 years, working with families on a low income across the UK. So I just want to start off just telling you a little bit about the COVID Realities Research Programme. So we began putting the idea together way back in March 2020 when the pandemic first started to become a thing. So it was there was a call for evidence, a call for submissions from the Nuffield Foundation, and they were really interested in trying to find out what would the societal impacts of COVID be. So at this point, we were sort of seeing that COVID was not going to be felt equally. So for those who were living on the lowest incomes and in particular groups, we knew that those people were going to have, COVID was going to have a worse impact upon them. So we decided that we were interested in looking at, how was COVID going to impact families who were living on a low income? What would it be like if you were living on a low income with dependent children under the age of 19? How was that going to be for you? And at the same time, we were really interested to know how the social security system was responding. So how were the government trying to put in place, were they trying to put in place anything to help families on a low income? So what we did, we partnered with the charity Child Poverty Action Group. And so together with Child Poverty Action Group and the Universities of York and Birmingham, we came together as a research team to start thinking, well, what are the impacts of COVID for families on a low income? There was a whole range of work packages. Like I said earlier, I'm only going to talk about one today because there's so much I could say that it will not fit into 7 minutes. So I'm going to just talk about the participatory research. So participatory research is very much about developing the research from the beginning with participants themselves. So back in April 2020, we sought a very small pilot group of families, 13 families on a low income, and worked together with them to try and develop a platform for them to share their experiences with us. Now, most participatory research will be done in person rather than online. So this was the first time that myself and the other researchers had actually done any sort of online participatory work. We didn't know how it would work. Would families on low income be able to actually access, an online platform to work with us because of the, potential barriers and digital exclusion, for example. So we worked alongside families to create a bespoke platform working with a web developer. And you can see the platform on covidrealities.org, which is our website. But we worked with families on low income for 2 years, and we used a variety of techniques to sort of find out what life was like for them. So one of the ways we did this was through online diaries. So people would submit diaries. They could do this as frequently or infrequently as they liked. And they could also respond to video elicited questions that we call big questions of the week. And so myself or other members of the research team and eventually other participants or organisations we worked with would record a question that was sort of responding to something that was topical around COVID in the news that week. So we would film ourselves for like 30, 40 seconds saying, how do you feel about getting the vaccine, for example? And then families could then respond either by written, audio or video response. And so this built up a sort of live ongoing archive of people's experiences. And another way we came together and worked with participants was through online, we called them Big Ideas groups. So these were groups that we ran on Zoom on an evening, and around 25 or 30 participants each time would come along once a month, and we would work in quite a focused way to think, well, from all of this amazing and rich data that we get in, how can we turn this into policy recommendations? How can we communicate this, to policymakers and people in power? We also did some arts-based outputs, and this was very much led by participants themselves. They wanted to explore different ways of sharing their experiences that weren't just written, and that would sort of move beyond, like I say, move beyond the written word. So we made we did zine making workshops, which are very much like a DIY magazine. And I've got some images to show you on the next few slides of what that looked like. And we worked together with a zine artist in online groups where we sent out packs to families with, stencils, scissors, different colour pens, etc. And we could put together these zines to represent experiences. We also had, we did some audio discussions with a sound artist, and you can find all these on the website. And just again about really putting it in people's own words about what it was like to be living on low income during COVID. So I just want to give you a few numbers and figures of what exactly this looked like. So overall, just over a 2-year period, we had 187 families who signed up, and this was from sort of all corners of the UK. Who got involved. And of those, 125 families wrote a diary entry. So quite a lot of people who initially signed up went on to contribute to the platform. And so we had 51 families who wrote 10 or more diary entries. And in total, we had almost 414,000 words submitted. So you can see these on the live archive on our website, and we've sort of collated them by theme. So you can click on a theme such as food banks or a theme like Christmas or something like that. So then it pulls up every single relevant diary entry related to that theme. And so our busiest month, we had 367 diary entries. Over 25 of those online discussion, big ideas groups that I mentioned. And as well, one of the things that families were keen to do was sort of get the messages out beyond the website. So to parliamentarians, to in television and radio interviews. So there was in total 29 families who actually took part in those activities. And to support families, we brought in external media training from Joseph Rowntree Foundation, just so people that we were working with, were able to sort of convey their stories and experiences in the best possible way, and to sort of try and eliminate as many barriers to that as possible. So you can see as well as various, and this is all on the website, various ways that we then shared experiences, from open access reports to blog posts and briefings. And again, many of these were written by families themselves and project partners. So we very much, at all stages, tried to ensure we're being led by what participants wanted to do. And we also published 2 books. And again, this was led by what participants wanted. So we wrote a book in collaboration with participants, and again, brought in an external writing coach who worked with participants to develop their writing skills. So I just wanted to show you a couple of images from the zine. If you're not familiar with zines, they're sort of like DIY magazines, sort of associated with fanzine culture. And so you'll see here, it's just really quite powerful and effective visual representations of what families were telling us and what their experiences were. And so these zines, we've used them in events with the House of Lords, for instance, as just another way, like I say, of sort of really communicating families' experiences. And so these were not just the parents as well who took part when we sent out zine making packs. Sometimes people's children got involved as well and made their own zine. So you can see it was really sort of representing the sort of family experience of what life was like during COVID. And so I'm probably aware I've spoke for more than 7 minutes, but I'm just going to talk very briefly about possibilities and challenges of trying to do this sort of participatory work in a virtual way. So some of the possibilities then, so I think very much the potential in actually sort of, trying to have these participatory online spaces. People told us that if it hadn't have been online, they wouldn't have been able to take part because they couldn't have travelled, for instance, for people who had mobility issues or, significant caring responsibilities, which was, a lot of the people we were working with. They said actually the fact that we were doing it in the online way meant that they could take part. So, like I say, we did then have a lot of participation from all across the country. Obviously, within that as well, there are, like I said earlier, tensions in who can actually access that space. So what we would do is try and break down those barriers. So we would, if people didn't have Wi-Fi, for instance, the project would pay for that sometimes, would pay for data, before the big ideas groups, we would offer to be someone's Zoom buddy to do sort of training with them so that they could be familiar with how to use Zoom. And then one of the project team would be a sort of Zoom buddy during that on the chat and just check in, are you okay? Is there anything, do you feel comfortable? And we just really try to, think about what potential barriers there could be for people getting involved in this sort of way. And I've mentioned this a couple of times, but it was really important for us that we involved participants at every stage. So this happened from the very start of the pilot until all the way through as the project evolved, which meant that we had to actually go back to the funders twice to ask for more money because what we wanted to do and what participants wanted to do, we couldn't know that at the beginning because it was participatory. So we were lucky that we had a flexible funder who gave us that space to be able to be creative and flexible. I think one of the really important things about how we worked on COVID realities was actually that sort of personal human touch, which I think, again, was really important during the pandemic when we were all sort of locked in the house, working online or, juggling, having kids at home and all of those things. So I think what we would try and do was really take time to sort of think about how we can build relationships with people. So, the research team, we would, in those sort of big questions of the week that we would record, we would share something of our week and what that meant to us. And we very much had like this, ethics of reciprocity in terms of, we were trying to break down barriers between us as researchers and the people we were working with as participants. So trying to create a more level playing field. So what we would do, for instance, on the big ideas groups, which would happen monthly, we would send out a welcome pack. And this only cost us about £5 to make, but it would have, tea and coffee, biscuits, something like a little treat for the kids, pens, COVID Realities branded notebooks and things like that. It made people feel, they were sort of, their time was being valued at the same time as, things that you would be able to do in person. So if we did participatory event in person, we would have coffee, we'd have lunch and things like that. So we tried to think, well, what can we do to make it a little bit more, more of an event for people taking part? And at the same time, we tried to ensure that, if people did anything like a blog post or spoke to the media, they would always get a shopping voucher to thank them for the time. So we weren't able to offer cash, but after every 4 diaries, for instance, people received a £20 voucher. After every big ideas group, again, £20 voucher. So we always tried to, in some way, thank people in a sort of monetary way for their time. And again, I think one of the things that has been a real value in COVID realities is actually thinking and working with a project partner like Child Poverty Action Group, thinking, well, how can we turn all of this into actual concrete policy recommendations? How can we get this into policymakers' hands? So that was, again, working in collaboration with a charity like Child Poverty Action Group. It really helped us to sort of, focus our efforts on, right, okay, how can we turn these into action? But obviously some of the challenges and risks in working in this way, I mean, one key challenge was, at first when we were devising the project, we were really aware that, this was a really difficult time for everybody. Nobody knew what was going to happen with COVID. Everyone was in a sort of, state of, we didn't know what was going on. So we were like, well, is it fully ethical to, be asking people on a low income who are already, we know they're going to be more impacted by COVID in many ways. Is it ethical to say, well, we want you to take part in this project? So we spent a lot of time thinking, well, how can we do this in the most ethical way possible? And so again, that was where it was really important that we were led by what participants wanted and how they felt and how they experienced the project. I think a real key issue for me in terms of working on the project has been, well, what change is actually possible in our current context? So, we've got a very hostile policy context in terms of, the government's response in terms of the social security system. So actually managing expectations and realities of, well, how can we actually change or inform policy has been something that we've really had to juggle throughout the project. And I think properly valuing expertise of experience as well. So, like I just said, we tried to think about if people took part in the project, they would be compensated in terms of Love to Shop shopping vouchers, but sometimes there were issues in terms of people being able to redeem those, and also it isn't the same as paying somebody a proper wage for their time. So I think there are tensions there in how you can actually properly value that expertise that you get in as part of the project. And that's linked to the next point, which is when does this sort of voluntary participatory engagement become exploitative? And we really did sort of spend a lot of time trying to think, well, how can we best recognise people's time and experience in the project? And again, thinking about, well, who really benefits from this sort of work? We would want the participants who we're working with to be, the main beneficiaries, but then at the same time, like today, for example, it's me stood here telling you about the project, not one of the participants. So it's sort of trying to manage those like hierarchies of power that are already built into the research process, which sort of brings me to the last point there without realising. And I just wanted to end on just a couple of quotes. There's so many more on the website, but just sort of some feedback from participants that we got on being a part of COVID Realities. So very much the feedback will be centred around, people telling us, well, I feel I've got a voice and I feel, I can do small things, I can be a part of history. So, very much the archive of experiences we've got on the website, it is a snapshot of those just over 2 years, that very, particular time when COVID was just starting, we were in and out of lockdowns, so it is very much a sort of historical piece in a way as well. Again, another quote talking about, I feel I've got a voice, it's a lovely feeling. And people also talked about being a part of the project and how it could be beneficial for their mental health. And we very much, as time went on throughout the project, COVID Realities really did become a sort of a community where people came together in solidarity and sort of developed ideas and changed together. So hopefully, that's given you a quick overview of the project, but please do look at the website, which is covidrealities.org, and you'll see a whole other range of resources on there. But thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you so much. How incredibly interesting and such important work as well that's being done. So thank you so much for sharing that. You can see the Slido slide again, so you can post your questions. We've had some come through already, which is great. So I'd now like to invite Professor Zubair Ahmed from the College of Medical and Dental Sciences. Thank you, Zubair.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you guys for being here and those who are online. I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain and what happens when things go wrong. I'm a professor in neuroscience, and I look at trauma and how trauma affects the brain in terms of repair and regeneration. Can we repair the brain? Can we not? And things like that. So to start off with, I'm going to ask you to do a bit of brain work. I'll ask you a few questions. So how much of your brain do you think you use at any one time? Can you put your hand up and just quickly answer that? Anybody know? How much of your brain? Some would say something you use nothing. Yes. Okay, anybody want to increase on that? 100? 100, okay, at any one time? At any one time, that's a key word here. Anyone else? I'll have one more. 20%. 20%, thank you very much. It's more towards the bottom end, so 10 to 20% at any one time. However, don't get me wrong, you use all of your brain, or you should be using all of your brain. The reason why you only use a small proportion is because it's a highly metabolic area of your brain. It requires a lot of energy, a lot of oxygen, lots of everything else to try and get it to grow. But at any one time, you use up to about 20% of your brain for doing a specific function. So something like me talking to you, I'm probably using about 10 to 20% of my brain, but you use different parts of your brain, and I'll show you why in a moment. Okay, you're all running down the stairs, at home, you run down the stairs, nothing happens, you're fine, you're at the other end. As soon as you start thinking, oh, I'm running down the stairs, why do you stumble? Anyone thought about that? Anyone have any answer?
We use more primitive parts of the brain to do such automatic movements, such as running down the stairs, but as soon as it maybe comes into the prefrontal cortex, it kind of puts a stop on that unconscious.
It's a very good answer, and it's almost there, actually. Anyone else? This is a complicated one, so I'll answer for you. When you're running down the stairs, you don't think about it. It's an involuntary action almost, but you are thinking about it because you have to will yourself to move. There's a part of your brain, which is the primitive part of your brain, that measures what you actually are doing now versus what you intended to do. So before I move, I've already made a subconscious intention to move. But if I don't move that way and move backwards, my brain goes, oh, what's going on here? So running down the stairs, your brain thinks, oh, what's he doing? This is really dangerous. Stop. Fires your motor neurons, which stops your muscles there and then. That's why you stumble. So next time you run down the stairs, don't think that you're running down the stairs, just do it. Okay, next question. In terms of the senses that you have around you, so your vision, your taste, and all of these things, which is the most distrustworthy sense that you have? And the clues on the third question. So your sense of smell? Me touching the table? Anybody know?
See.
Your vision, why is that? Somebody said vision. Why is it your vision?
Because you can see various things, but your brain is taking in so much information that your brain fills in.
Oh, really good, really good. But it's almost there. Anyone else? Right, me touching this object, you have a neuron that recognizes that I'm touching something. It then sends a signal to another neuron which says you've touched something, which then sends it to my brain, which then interprets it to my muscle. So it's connected. There's something flowing between all of the neurons to tell me that I'm touching something. Vision is completely different. So you see with two eyes, right goes to your left, left goes to your right. You should all know that in the brain. The bit that sees what you see, sees it upside down. So at the moment, you guys are sitting on the ceiling, not on these chairs. But the bit that interprets what you see turns you the right way around because it thinks, hang on a minute, these guys can't be sitting on the ceiling. But there's a gap between the bit that sees what you're seeing now to the bit that interprets what you see. And at the moment, we don't know what's happening here. So we say it's a psychosomatic projection, meaning we don't know. It's like a hocus pocus, blah, 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 and this is what you see. And the other thing is that when you look around the room, there is no way that you've seen everything. What your brain does is it fills in the information, just like as you said. It fills in the information. Sometimes it fills it with gobbledygook. Sometimes it can fill it with stuff that you haven't seen. So remember, the reason why your senses, your vision is the most trustworthy is because of that gap. There is nothing. There's no chemical reaction. There's no electrical impulses. It's just nobody knows. It's a psychosomatic projection. It means that you're seeing what you think you see. But we always see everybody the right way around. Okay, final one. When I stick my hand up, normally it shouldn't shake. But if it starts shaking, what does that mean? Okay, why doesn't it shake, first of all? Okay, because it can shake, but you've got inhibitory neurons. You've got neurons that fire your muscles to move, so I can do all of this, and I can stop myself from doing that. You've got things that stop that motion. But if you start losing some of the neurons, then you start shaking. For example, Parkinson's. Specific type of neurons die back. Therefore, you lose that control, you start shaking, you do all sorts of other things as well. So when you think about the brain, think about those sorts of things that I've just told you, and then think about some of the diseases that we can think of. And in the neuroscience and ophthalmology section, we look at eye diseases, but also brain diseases, spinal cord diseases. And if I go to my slide now, everything in blue is what's called the peripheral nervous system, the bits on the side. So your sciatic nerve, which runs down your leg. So if you have a bit of back pain and sciatica, that's the one that's troubling you. Everything in blue regenerates. Okay, and you could get, even though the peripheral nerve regenerates, you only get about 80% function back. You can't get 100% function at the moment. Things in red, the brain, the spinal cord, and there's one other nerve that's not depicted on there, the nerve that goes from your eye to your brain. They're all part of the central nervous system. And it's that we're very interested in our department. And there are 15 PIs per principal investigator working on this phenomena in terms of disease and why the central nervous system does not regenerate. So we have colleagues who work on the eye, how can we get that to regenerate? Colleagues who work on the brain, we can get that to regenerate. And I do a lot of work on spinal cord injury and how we can get that to regenerate and therefore restore function. With spinal cord injury, depends where you're injured. You'll lose everything below that. So if you're unfortunately in a car accident and you've injured high up here, you'll lose everything below you. Some people are very lucky, they can still retain arm function. Same with the brain. This is why the brain is so complex, because every bit innervates different areas of you. Hence, if you lose a little bit, you can then have deficits in different areas. One other number, let's say if you pick up a phone number, your home phone number, I don't know, whatever it is, 0121, blah, 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 whatever. Is that organized like a filing cabinet in your brain? So it's a specific area, or is it in lots of different areas of your brain? Anyone? So a number, anybody's number, is organized in lots of different areas of your brain. And so when you want to recall it, it sort of jumbles back together and you have your complete number. But let's say you have some sort of injury, you've damaged yourself. You might lose one or two numbers. So you might remember the majority of it, but you might not remember a couple of numbers. It's the same with faces. It's the same with some of the diseases that you can remember faces, but you can't remember their name. You can remember names, but you can't spell their names. You can remember a part of their name, but not the other parts of their name. Things like that. So it's the brain that something's happened to the brain that causes that. And at the moment, unfortunately, if things like that happen, we can't really do a lot for you, except manage the scenarios, because there's nothing that can repair the central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system, there are lots of useful repair techniques that we can use. And obviously with the central nervous system, because it controls so many different functions, you lose function. Same with lots of diseases. Everyone heard of multiple sclerosis? Multiple sclerosis is the disease of myelin, which is the sheath that's around each nerve that protects the nerve from losing its function. Once that degrades away, you lose function, you start wasting away, and eventually people die from it. So these are sorts of things that we are tackling. We're trying to understand what goes wrong, and then how can we fix it. When it comes to brain injury, the biggest cause is falls. I was trying to do a study at UHB, and I looked at, during COVID, so 2020, 2021, we were all supposed to be in lockdown. I was interested in how many spinal cord injured patients there were. Would you believe that didn't change at all? We still had the same number of patients, even though we were all sitting at home, because a few years ago, motor vehicle accidents was the biggest cause of brain injury and spinal cord injury. The reason why this number stayed the same is because people are climbing ladders or falling off ladders and stuff and having spinal injuries that way. So now falls has overtaken motor vehicle accidents as the biggest cause of brain injury, spinal cord injury, and even eye injury as well. When you injure your brain, the waves shatter the whole system. Your eyes are affected as well. So you lose vision, you lose brain function, you can lose spinal cord function as well. So all of those are affected. That's why we look at all of them together. The other thing that we're doing very importantly, and I'll finish on this, sports injuries. You must have all heard that rugby players are complaining that, you know, they're having dementia at the age of 40 and stuff like that. Several people have come out recently. Now footballers are coming out with similar sorts of problems as well. And we do a lot of work with the Rugby Football Union, but also the professional league footballers, where we're collecting saliva and we collect blood during season and off season. And what we do is we've developed a pitch-side test in saliva to show how concussed these patients might be. And so, and what's clear to us is that a bash to the head is not good, but a repeated bash is what causes the problems eventually. And some of these rugby players, when they're in a tackle, they could be bashing their heads at least 10 to 15 times in a game. Now, they're not concussed after each one, but these are what we call subconcussive. And if you total up the relative forces that they generate, that can total up a lot. You've got an 18-stone person running at 20 mile an hour at you. That's quite a lot of force. So we've got a pitch-side test now that we can give them to say in their saliva we've got markers that we can look for in terms of concussion. And we can tell players now, you need to rest for this long. They hate this because they don't want to rest. They're professionals, they want to play. But we now have a pitch-side test that we can give them. Other people are developing mouth guards, for example, that can monitor, and somebody sits with a computer at the side of every game, and they monitor everybody, if they bash to the head, how much the forces were, is it time to take that player off, give them a rest, because we know that if you rest them for a little bit, then they're fine. In laboratory studies, we can do a head injury immediately and then 3 days later, and you still have that metabolic vulnerability. But if you do that at 5 days, there's no difference at all. So these are sorts of things that we're doing and taking these into the real world scenario. Obviously, there's lots of other things that can cause brain injury, not just trauma. There's other things like non-traumatic events like tumours and things like that. But I won't talk about that. I hope that's given you a bit of a flavour of what the brain and how amazing it is and what it functions. And next time you're running up the stairs or remember something, think of what I've said. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I do feel like we should all start thinking about using more than 10% of our brain at any one time. So again, the slide is here. So we've got some fantastic questions coming through that we look forward to asking our panellists later and having a bit of a discussion about. So I'd now like to invite Professor Richard Butler to come up and speak to us. Thank you so much, Richard.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I'm going to talk about dinosaurs for the next 8 minutes or so. And this the session today is entitled Research That Matters. And perhaps compared to some of the other things that we're talking about today, dinosaurs might seem a bit frivolous. So I'm going to talk to start with about why I think research on dinosaurs is important. So I'm going to give you 3 reasons that I think dinosaurs are significant as an area for research. Now, one is that dinosaurs are really deeply, deeply embedded in our culture. You see dinosaurs everywhere. So there's some examples on the screen. We see dinosaurs in films and TV, all kinds of books aimed at all kinds of different ages, in music, computer games, and so on. So dinosaurs are clearly important to us in some way as a society. We're clearly very interested in dinosaurs. Secondly, I think dinosaurs are a fantastic tool that we have to engage people of all ages, all kinds of backgrounds, with a whole range of different kind of scientific, evolutionary and geological topics. And we can do this through museum settings, such as our fantastic Lapworth Museum of Geology here on the campus. We can do this, we have educational groups coming in. Dinosaurs are part of the national curriculum. Because they really are a great tool for engaging children with science. But it's not limited to museum and school environments. We can also do this in the great outdoors. So we have places like the Jurassic Coast down in Dorset, which is world famous as a UNESCO World Heritage Site for its fossils. And we have dinosaur track sites down there, for example, shown on the bottom right of the screen here, which are places that people can go and engage with dinosaurs in outside spaces. And beyond kind of educational benefits, this also has actual economic benefits to those regions where those museums and those kind of outdoor attractions are based. And then the third reason I think dinosaurs are worth studying is actually we can do some fairly serious science with them. So they have a pretty good fossil record, much better than the kind of the general perception. It's been extremely well studied, and we could use it to do a lot of kind of quantitative statistical analyses of how evolution works. And so I've put a couple of images from a couple of examples on the screen. One example on the left is research that we do here at the university about how climate change over geological periods of time drives the evolution of large vertebrates on land, and dinosaurs are a key study group for that. And then there's also been lots and lots of studies around things like major extinction events in the fossil record, mass extinctions, and these actually have relevance to understanding biodiversity crises today. And again, dinosaurs are a key study group for understanding past mass extinction events. So actually, there's a whole host of reasons that I think dinosaurs are worth studying in an academic, scientific sense. And actually, I think this is something we're very good at the University of Birmingham. So we have a smallish group of people working on dinosaurs, but the work that team produces actually includes some of the highest kind of media profile stories that this university produces every year. So a couple of years ago, the image on the left of the screen, a remarkable dinosaur embryo found in China. One of our PhD students, Fion Ma, was involved in the publication of this, insights into how dinosaurs grew. And this was the biggest news story that this university had that year. Enormous global media attention. The image in the top middle of the screen is from a big news story, big scientific paper news story last year. Again, one of the top news stories for the whole university. One of my colleagues, Stefan Lautenschlager, who works on kind of how dinosaur skulls are constructed and how they functioned. And so this was a paper around kind of eye shapes in meat-eating dinosaurs and how that, what that tells you about their kind of predatory strategies. And again, enormous international media attention. We do field work in a variety of different places around the world. So there's an image on the right of the screen there that is me in Morocco back in the autumn with colleagues from Fez and from the Natural History Museum in London excavating Jurassic dinosaurs. And then we also have students engaged in this research. So the image at the bottom is a couple of my undergraduate students, and they are at a site called Spyway Quarry down in Dorset, which is a dinosaur track site, and they're creating a 3D model of that site. And the aim of what they're doing there is to monitor how that site has changed through time as the public has engaged with that site. And that has that's actually fed through into a publication that's coming out very soon that those undergraduates are involved in. So we do a lot of different kinds of research on dinosaurs, and I think that this university is very good at it. So I'm going to give you one example in a bit more detail of one of the research projects that I've been involved in. I'm very interested in understanding the origins of dinosaurs. So dinosaurs were around in a period of time called the Mesozoic. We break that down into 3 different intervals, the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. I'm interested in the earliest of those, perhaps the most obscure of those, the Triassic. And this is the time interval when dinosaurs first appear. So Triassic stretches from about 252 to about 200 million years ago, and this is when dinosaurs emerge. This is what the world looked like during the Triassic. This is the classic heyday of the supercontinent Pangaea. All of the modern landmasses joined into this single landmass, which is a much warmer, more arid world than it is today. And actually, if we were to remove all of the vegetation and soil beneath us here, we've got Triassic rocks below us in Birmingham. So it's possible that there are some Triassic dinosaurs below us somewhere here, but we just probably will never be able to access them because we don't have rock exposed at the surface. This is what the southwest of England looked like in the late part of the Triassic. So sea levels were higher in this part of the world, and rather than having kind of the modern landmass, we have a series of islands making up much of the UK. And so we have an island archipelago, and we have a series of remarkable fossil deposits from South Wales and from the southwest of England that tell us what the animals that were living on those islands looked like. And there's a couple of images on the right of the screen there, which are not dinosaurs. We have some early mammal fossils which have come from this part of the country, which are perhaps somewhere on our own evolutionary lineage. And at the top right of the screen, there's a very small-bodied, greyhound-like crocodilian called Terrestriosuchus, which is another remarkable fossil known from these deposits. But in addition to these, we sometimes have dinosaurs preserved in these deposits from South Wales and the southwest of England. And so that's the example that I want to talk about just for a couple of minutes, really. And this is a paper that we were involved in last year, together with the Natural History Museum in London. And this was describing a new dinosaur species from one of these deposits in South Wales. The fossils that we have of this animal are shown on the screen. These are in the collection in London, and actually collected quite a long time ago, but sat in the collections of the Natural History Museum unstudied for many, many years until we started working on them during the first lockdown. What you can see is on the left of the screen, we've got a pelvis of a carnivorous dinosaur. So we've got some of the bones of the backbone connecting to the pelvis. On the right of the screen, we've got a femur, an upper leg bone. It's a pretty incomplete skeleton, but there's enough there for us to tell quite a lot about this animal, including that it's a new species of a small, probably about a metre in length, carnivorous dinosaur. So we named it as a new species. We gave it the name Pendrige milneri. It's the oldest dinosaur known from anywhere in the UK. It's only the third dinosaur ever discovered and named from Wales, and it's the first dinosaur ever to be given a Welsh language name. So Pendrige is from Middle Welsh, meaning approximately chief dragon or chief warrior, and it's also the family name of King Arthur. So King Arthur's father was Pendragon was the surname, and that's the anglicised form of Pendrige. So it's also an allusion to kind of to King Arthur. So this is what Pendrige might have looked like. So this is a small carnivorous dinosaur, say about a metre in length, living in this very strange island archipelago, much more tropical and warm than the southwest of England and South Wales today, during the late Triassic, about 210 million years ago. And it's a really interesting and significant animal in terms of understanding the dinosaur fossil record within the UK. But it can also tell us something a bit broader about kind of how evolution works in general. So there is a general pattern or generalization in evolutionary biology referred to as the island rule. And this is the idea that islands are quite strange places in an evolutionary sense. And one of the things that happens on islands is that when animals reach them, big animals evolve to get smaller, perhaps because of the more limited resources that there are on the islands, and sometimes small animals evolve to get bigger. But the more common pattern that we see in the fossil record and we see on islands today is we have animals that are miniaturized compared to animals on the mainland. And the example given here, there's a very small elephant on the screen there, much smaller than a human. And these are dwarf elephants living on Mediterranean islands in the last kind of 10 million years or so. Extinct now, but which we know from the fossil record. So this is a widely held generalization in evolutionary biology, but we don't know how far this applies in the past. And actually in the southwest of England and South Wales, we have these very, very old island faunas, the oldest known in the fossil record, more than 200 million years old. And we might be able to use these to test whether this evolutionary generalization is something that's existed through the whole of Earth history or is something that is a more recent phenomenon. And we can do that by looking at animals like Pendrige, by estimating their size, and by putting them into evolutionary trees. And then we can look at how evolution of body size has changed on those trees. So there's an evolutionary tree of early carnivorous dinosaurs shown on the screen here through the Triassic to the Jurassic. And onto that tree, we have mapped body size. So warmer colours are larger bodied animals. The cooler, kind of the blues and the lighter greens are smaller animals. And when we do that, we find that this animal, Pendrige, it's a very small dinosaur, but actually it belongs within a group of other small dinosaurs. It's not uniquely small, so that suggests that it's not an animal that's undergone this kind of miniaturization. And perhaps the island rule doesn't necessarily apply in these very deep time ecosystems. Perhaps it's something that's more associated with the kind of the recent climatic conditions that we have over the last 10 to 20 million years. And this is part of a kind of a broader piece of work that we're doing on these island faunas from the southwest of England and South Wales to understand kind of past processes on islands and how they affected evolution. So I'll stop there. I think the message is that dinosaurs are cool, they're fun, but actually we can also do, I think, some interesting and important science with them as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. As you can see here, the Slido to add some more questions. Lots more are coming in, which is great. I do now feel a personal responsibility to explore other periods other than Jurassic, which is the only one that we know for probably quite obvious reasons. So thank you so much. So I'd now like to invite our final speaker, Professor Andrew Quinn, to come up and share with us too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Thank you, everyone. So I'd like to talk to you about adaptation, climate change. So clearly something that I expect that most of you are well aware of. But my title is Professor of Climate Adaptation. So I'd like to explore what that means for a minute. So if we look at one of these graphs of how the average temperature of the world has developed until today, but also how it might develop in the future, we talk a lot, and we see politicians talking at things like the COP meetings about emissions of CO2. And reducing our CO2 emissions will clearly make a difference as to how the future pans out. So those different coloured lines there talk about different amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere. But even if we change our behaviour today, the changes in the CO2 level will not kick in until something like 2040, 2050. And you can see from all of those coloured lines that the temperature in the world, and from that also the rainfall and other patterns, will continue to change throughout time, and we need, therefore, to think about how we live our lives differently, not just to reduce our CO2 emissions, but also to make sure that the way in which we live today is possible in the future. So I've been drawn to this subject because of disruption, things like storm events, things like flooding. And these are things that we need to learn to live with and develop ideas around. We also have a changing world population. So many people think that our population will continue to grow exponentially. That's not true. It's not true from history, but it is changing every day. Continues to increase. But there are signs that it will not continue to increase forever. So very recently, in the last couple of weeks, you may have heard a news story where for the first time ever the Chinese population started to decrease. So we actually have strong projections that world population will increase up to around 10 or 11 billion people, around about, again, 2050, 2060. We see these patterns changing. So we do have, as well as that, increasing urbanization. So these people are living more closely, more densely in the world. And therefore the systems that we use to provide ourselves with clean water, with clean air, with transport, with places to live, all of these systems that we rely on need to change in order to keep up with these things. And that is why I, from the School of Engineering, am interested in what sometimes appears to be social science or geography. Because we need to think about reducing people's vulnerability. We need to think about how exposed they are in the places that they live to different sorts of hazards. Those might be high temperatures, and it's not the average temperature or the average rainfall that causes the problem. It's the extreme values that cause the problem. So we need to think about these things. We need to think about where people live, where people work, how they move between those places, how they get their food, where does that come from? And we look at these things and we categorize them broadly as vulnerability, but equally different people in different areas are not equally vulnerable. So their social condition, poverty, which we've heard about as well, very much affects their vulnerability to all sorts of different hazards. And we can do things to help and develop both understanding and physical infrastructure that supports these kind of communities. So it's very important that we understand both the hazards, but also what we can do about them in future. So I'd like to talk a little bit about one example of a project where we've been doing that, and that is about supporting governments and transport organisations in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia in developing their adaptation plans to the changing climate. And here you see a map, and on this map, the lighter colours are countries which have developed the first stage of an adaptation plan, what's called an adaptation action plan. And in the darker colour, you begin to see the recent development of more complex, more coherent and comprehensive national adaptation plans in countries. And as you can see, more and more countries are developing their understanding and developing their action plans for coping with the climate change, the population change, the urbanization, and other factors in our changing world. And when we go and talk to organizations and representatives in these countries, we talk to them about their transport infrastructure. What are the vulnerabilities of their transport infrastructure? And the conversations that we had there very much highlighted that they are aware of these vulnerabilities, but very much in the context of the present day, very much in the context of things like flooding, things like drainage issues, and all sorts of vulnerabilities associated with very much the here and now type of events. And what we need to encourage, we've developed from that the understanding that what we need to encourage is climate awareness. In our world, we're perhaps aware of climate change, we're aware of the impacts that it might have and what we need to do about it. But in other places, people are not able to incorporate that into the planning that they do. So there are many sophisticated tools, but some of them, they don't have the information to be able to use those tools effectively. So we need to think about that and develop their priorities, develop also the understanding and the information that can feed into those models. And one of the things that also became apparent from those discussions was that we need to build the links between government departments. Now, it may surprise you, living in the UK, that government departments don't always talk to each other. So that is true in other places as well. So we need to get people to think and work together, not just in government departments, but with places like transport operators, the people who run the buses, the trains, even the people who provide taxi services and so on, which are the backbone of transport systems in many cities across sub-Saharan Africa. And getting all of the stakeholders involved so that they can all understand the priorities and the needs to change is a really critical part of this. So we've, again, been trying to facilitate that kind of thing. And you might think that thinking about transport infrastructure, first of all, infrastructure isn't sexy. But for those of you sitting in the room at least, I think I can guarantee that engineers have saved your life at least twice today already. Transport infrastructure facilitates everything on the sustainable development scale. So we might talk about infrastructure as one sustainable development goal, but it actually has direct and indirect effects on many other things. Healthcare provision, food provision, development of market economy are all based on this idea of transport. So resilient transport is actually the foundation which allows so much more sustainable development within the world. And that's why I think it's absolutely the way that engineers will save the world. So thank you very much for your attention. If you're interested, we've got some publications there which you're welcome to have a look at. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So again, opportunity to ask questions of Andrew or indeed all of our other panellists. I think we can agree that this is absolutely research that matters. Every one of our speakers has illustrated that. So we've had some great questions come in. I'm just going to have a look at these now, if that's okay. And I'm going to go with the ones that you have voted for in in the sense of you would like to know the answer to this question too. And our first one is for Zubair, if that's okay. So people are interested in how much force in an injury is needed for permanent long-term damage to occur.
Okay, that's a very, very good question, and also it's going to have a long answer. I'm afraid.
Okay, shall I give you a time limit?
No,
Zubair? Would
don't
you like
worry.
that?
Don't worry, I'll stick to time. Okay, yeah, we're all different, so that's the biggest thing. Some people will have a brain injury just falling off a chair. Some people we know have fallen off, a two-story building and not had anything. So it just depends on the type of fall or an accident or whatever that you might have, plus your own composition, whether you're a muscly person, whether you're less muscular, whether you've had, you've had previous injuries, that can also, make you more susceptible to further injuries and things like that as well. So it really depends on the individual and the way you've fallen. And when it comes to brain injury, there are two types of brain injury: a closed head injury, where you don't have any damage to the skull itself, or an open injury, which means that something has penetrated inside your brain. Obviously, that's a lot more serious, and that causes a lot more damage, and very little force is required for that, for example. Whereas the closed head, you need a slightly bigger force. But to give you a number, it would be very difficult to give you a number off the top of my head, because of the fact that we're all so different. And it'll be a different thing for different person.
Thank you so much. A very clear answer. Thank you. So another question that's come in is actually for Richard. And I'm hoping you understand the question as well as can provide the answer. So it's, does the island hypothesis relate to our own evolutionary history, such as with the human species discovered in Indonesia?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what the question is referring to is a species of the genus Homo, which has been nicknamed the Hobbit. It's discovered on the island of Flores in Indonesia, which is very small in size. And there is the hypothesis there that the reason that hominid species is small is because it's living on an island. So absolutely, that is an example of the island rule, or a proposed example of the island rule. There's some controversy behind it, but that is one of the examples you could give as potentially relating to the island rule.
Thank you. And I did understand the question from your answer, which is great. So our next question is going to be for you, Andrew, which I'm also interested in. How has engineering saved my life twice today?
Right. Anybody drunk any water today? Yeah. So clean water provided by an engineering plant has already saved you from cholera and typhoid. And the second one is, by sitting here today, I expect most of you travelled in by some form of transport. So about 250,000 people every day travel in and out of Birmingham safely on the basis of transport systems that otherwise could cause significant injury and accidents. So I reckon twice is pretty good.
That's pretty good. It's probably more than twice then, isn't it, if we think about it?
In your case, given your commute this morning, yes, I think so.
Indeed it is. There was a lorry fire this morning that I was talking to Andrew about, which delayed my journey, but I think chemical engineers probably saved the lorry and the fire in the motorway, and
Indeed.
let me get here today, which I'm very delighted for. So thank you, Andrew, for that. So our next question for you, Kaylee. People are interested in, obviously, the project. How did you find the participants for your COVID reality projects?
Yeah, so we started off with each of the researchers started with their own networks in particular geographical areas. So, for example, I'm from the Northeast. So we started off, we had like a Northeast cohort. We ended up with a Northern Irish cohort. So it started off quite small, but then we would sort of snowball from that and say, well, can you tell your friends about this? Do they want to get involved? But it also involved things like getting in touch with, charities and food banks and any organisations really that were working with people on low income to say, well, can you share the information with people who you're working with? So one thing that we did, we created small postcards with like a QR code on there, so we could pop those into like food parcels, for example. So a lot of food banks up and down the country, we sent those postcards out, and they would stick a postcard in with a food parcel. So that was, those were a couple of the ways that we did it, but ultimately it took a lot of time and a lot of effort to really try and sort of ensure we were getting to the people that we wanted to get to. So one example, when we could see, and I think the cohort we worked with, it was around 86% were women. So we would contact charities that were working with young fathers, for example, to try and, ensure we're hearing voices from fathers as well. So we just tried to be sort of responsive to the, to the participants that were coming in, but also trying to, fill in any gaps and think, well, what are we missing? Whose voices are we not getting here?
Thank you so much, Kaylee. Incredibly creative ways of working with these participants too. So this is a question for Zubair, and a number of people are interested in the answer to that, as indeed am I. What are you looking for in saliva in order to determine if there is an injury to the brain?
Thank you. Very, very good question. So we'd be looking for lots of things like proteins, which you release into your saliva. There are also bits of DNA and RNA that you release into your saliva, called microRNAs, tiny bits of RNAs, which we can assay. And we've assayed in rugby players, we've detected 14 of these microRNAs, tiny bits of RNA, that actually predicate what level of concussion they have, and they correlate very well to our clinical assessments of the types of levels of concussion they have and all the symptoms. There are lots of other things we're looking for. So, for example, you can look for particulates in saliva as well. Although mostly it's liquid, there are some particulates in there as well. We look for those, and we look to see what's happened in there. You can find some antibodies in saliva as well. So we can look for those and see what you've reacted to in your system before you've released the saliva. And those are all sorts of things that we're looking for. So proteins, bits of RNA that you release, and debris that might be there as well, but also things like antibodies and things like that as well.
Incredibly fascinating. Thank you so much. Very comprehensive answer. So our next question, again, people are interested in, for Richard. How do you decide where to start digging for dinosaurs?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think to find dinosaurs, you've got to have several things. You've got to have rocks that are exposed at the surface. So dinosaurs come out of rocks. You've got to have rocks somewhere that you can access them to find dinosaurs. Those rocks have to be the right geological age. So they have to be rocks of either Triassic, Jurassic or Cretaceous age. And they have to be the right kind of environment, because dinosaurs lived on land. So if we had rocks that are formed in deep marine environments, they're quite unlikely to have dinosaur fossils in them. So most dinosaur fossils come from rocks that were originally formed on land. So there's two ways that we can find those conditions. We can use geological maps. So the world has been mapped in great detail by geologists, and those maps tell you what the ages of the rocks in different parts of the world, and also something about the environments in which those rocks were formed. So you can use those maps to look for rocks that are of the right age and have the right environments. And then you can combine that with looking at the topography in those areas to see if there are going to be rocks exposed to the surface. It's easiest to find dinosaurs in places like deserts, which is why places like Mongolia, Morocco, the Western US are very famous for dinosaur discoveries, whereas Birmingham is not very famous for dinosaur discoveries. So it's a combination of those things, plus where people have found dinosaurs before is usually a good indication that there's a chance for future discoveries as well.
Thank you. It's a shame Birmingham isn't more known for its dinosaur discovery, but perhaps we can do some research around that. So a question now for you, Andrew, particularly important for Birmingham area as well. How can we change cities designed around private transport to be more accommodating to public transport?
Excellent question. Answers, please, to Birmingham City Council. Yes, so first of all, we need to think about the capacity of the public transport systems, because we can't attract people to use them if there isn't the space for them to do so. We need to think about, therefore, providing a positive service that people value. Price is obviously one element of that, but there's also a cultural change. There's a real sort of high value placed on private car transport, the independence of private car transport, and a lowering of the conscious awareness of the cost of that transport. So people very much equate it to the cost of fuel, forgetting the cost of the actual car, forgetting the cost of the insurance, and so on and so forth. And indeed, the indirect costs of having a parking space at both ends of the journey and so on. So I think it's partly to do with increasing people's awareness of the actual costs associated with private transport, but also making a real comparison and availability and capacity of the public transport systems. So that's really, really important when we look at things like intercity transport, say between Birmingham and London. You know about HS2. Many arguments have been made about HS2. So they started off with an argument that justified it in terms of saving 20 minutes on the journey time. But actually, fundamentally, the value of having a project like HS2 is an increase in capacity of the lines between London and Birmingham, because then we can increase the amount of freight and other passengers who are using that capacity, rather than simply making a faster service for a few people. So a project like HS2 can be justified on the basis of shifting people off the roads and onto the railway. But if it simply attracts the people who already use the railway to make extra journeys, then there is very little benefit to having it. So it's all to do with the cultural change about how we use transport, I think.
And actually increasing capacity on the trains is something we're probably all personally interested in, but I hadn't actually thought about the freight implications, so I think that's a really important point. Thank you so much, Andrew. Okay, so Kaylee, a question for you now, if that's okay. Now that some COVID or all COVID restrictions have been lifted, do you think low-income families are likely to keep those changes or go back to how things used to be?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Actually, it's interesting because after COVID realities, we've actually sort of moved on now to tracking like what's happening in terms of the impact of the cost of living on participants that we worked with. So this sort of sister project is carrying on called Changing Realities. So that's a 1-year project, and it's really trying to capture what's happened sort of as people have come out of one crisis, the pandemic, and then we've now moved into a subsequent crisis with cost of living. So we're seeing actually some similar patterns in terms of how families on a low income were experiencing, the changes to the social security system during COVID and those everyday sort of hardships and navigating those. So we are actually still working with quite a lot of the same participants from COVID realities as part of Changing Realities, but also opened it up to recruit further families who weren't involved in the first project. So that's very much an ongoing project. And again, has really got an emphasis on, working alongside policymakers and thinking about how we can, get the key messages from the research into the hands of people that can actually implement change.
Thank you so much. Really important aspect of the work, isn't it? The policy change that we're hearing about as well. Thank you. So back to Zubair. Again, another question of interest to a number of people. Why can issues arise in the brain without anything physically happening to the body?
That's a very, very good question. So throughout life, you have low levels of what we call inflammation. So when we eat something, we cause a little bit of inflammation. When you do anything, even brain activity, running, football, things like that, whatever you're doing, you have very, very low levels of inflammation. As you age, the capacity of that inflammation to affect you increases. And this inflammation happens without us knowing anything about it, without us detecting it, without us having any negative side effects from it at all, until it becomes to a level where now it starts to affect function. So this is why a lot of stuff we don't realize until it's almost too late for us to realize, because of the fact that it's affecting multiple systems then. Your brain also has this amazing capacity because it's got redundancy. For example, when you injure a nerve, you don't need every single nerve to grow back to have some function back. In laboratory tests, we've shown that even if you get 3% of those axons to regenerate back, you will get function back, and you can navigate yourself across a room and things like that. And even clinical studies where they've put in, stem cells to deliver some of the cells that can then give you a little bit of function. People have shown that only 3 or 4 of those cells have integrated into the person's retina, which is the back of the eye, but it's given them the ability to navigate a room, a dimly lit room, which they couldn't do before. So really, there's a lot of redundancy in the whole nervous system. You don't need all 100%. If you can regenerate 3%, 30% is what we're aiming for if we can get back. I think even 30% will give us pretty much everything that we need to do. So you do have that redundancy that happens throughout life, and no matter how old you get, you have that redundancy. Now, that redundancy gets a little bit less as you age because your capacity to repair gets a little bit less. And this process, what's called myelination, which is, putting a new myelin, which is a fatty sheath around the nerves, occurs throughout the whole of your life. It doesn't stop. It's very prominent in the early ages, so up to about 6 years old is when it's massive, and you get a lot of plasticity in that area, and lots of connections to other things. So really, when we do our learning, we do most of it in our early, very early on. Later on, it's a lot more difficult. Somebody at my age will find it very difficult to learn new things, but I can still learn. And it doesn't matter how old you get, you can still learn. Because of that plasticity that's available, plasticity is the ability for a neuron, so I might be a neuron, but I can send signals to another neuron and connect to another one. That way I've increased my capacity now by two or threefold. So that's what neurons can do. The other thing we've seen from spinal injuries, for example, is that if there is a saved neuron, so if that's a saved neuron and this is a damaged neuron, I can make a collateral to that, and I can still send whatever I wanted to send via that neuron. Okay, so that's the other thing that neurons can do is, once they're damaged, they'll try and find anything else that might still be saved. If they can find another bit, they'll attach onto that, and they can send their signals. And you wouldn't notice any different. Because again, you don't need all of your 100% neurons to be functioning for you to give that function. So essentially, it's down to the redundancy that you have in your nervous system for you to do that. And that's why you sometimes don't detect anything until it affects multiple systems. And then you do have the physical effects is what you see.
Thank you, Zubair. Good to know we can still learn, whatever age we are, especially important in a learning environment, isn't it? So thank you so much for that. So again, a question for Richard. How do you date dinosaurs accurately?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So it's quite challenging for us to work out how old geologically many of the dinosaurs we find are. The way to get a really accurate date is to use isotopic dating, radioisotopic dating, similar to the carbon dating that will be familiar to many people from archaeology. Different isotopic systems, so often uranium-lead isotopic systems are used for deep time, so for when you're trying to work out the age of things that are hundreds of millions of years old. But to do this, you have to have typically a volcanic deposit somewhere in your sequence of rocks from which you find your dinosaur. And that's not actually that common. We're finding more of them as we look for them much more carefully than we have done in the past. But actually a lot of sequences in which we find dinosaurs don't have rocks that we can get absolute dates for. So then there's a whole field of geology called biostratigraphy, which is about using fossils themselves to correlate between different units. So if we have an absolute date for a sequence of rocks at one part of the world, we've got an absolute date of 210 million years based upon a radioisotopic dating, and we have the same fossils there as in another part of the world, then we make an inference because the fossil assemblages are the same, the rocks are probably broadly the same age. But sometimes it's quite a complex chain of logic. So there's quite big uncertainties around the ages of lots of dinosaurs, perhaps in some cases on the order of 10 million years uncertainty or more, which is a bit unsatisfying for a lot of the work we might want to do.
That's quite a window, isn't it? It's 10 million.
Not necessarily to a geologist or a paleontologist.
Possibly not, no.
We work on slightly different timescales to the rest of the world.
And I think your discipline also wins the award for the most difficult and complex number of words, new words to learn as well. So thank you again for that. So Andrew, interesting question again around transport. Is transport the main focus for engineers to increase resilience?
Very interesting. It's definitely my main focus, but my colleagues will look at a number of different things. So we have people who look at cities, and in particular, sort of buried infrastructure. So we have a new facility here, unique facility on campus called the National Buried Infrastructure Facility, where we can actually bury pipes and cables into a simulation of the ground, and we can compress and wet and stress those cables and pipes in different ways, and we can look at how they might deteriorate over time. We've got people who look at our buildings. We also have people who look at the green environment in our cities and how we can utilize that to improve the conditions. Of course, we also have transport systems and other systems which span over large parts of the country. So the power network as well is an area of study for our resilience in the country. And particularly when you think about renewable energy, a lot of the areas of the country which are very useful for producing energy are off the coast, and they can be much further north than the majority of the population. So again, the resilience of the system that transmits power, electricity from one area to another is very important. And we have people who look at different fuels and so on. So there are many different aspects to the resilience problem, but I like to think that transport's the main one.
The most important one.
Oh, absolutely.
The one that will save the world, Andrew, if that's correct.
I'll share that with other people.
I think you can. Yes, it's allowed. So, Kaylee, a really important question here, and focusing on the impact, obviously, of research. What are the major challenges of turning research into policy?
Yes, that's a really good question, and one which keeps me awake at night. But I think, like I said in the presentation, it's been difficult in terms of trying to manage expectations around how, the participants that are getting involved in the project, they're taking all of their time to get involved, amidst everything that they're navigating in terms of living life on a low income to begin with, but then also the pandemic. So then, as a research team, we feel, we've got a responsibility to try and think, well, how can we get these experiences into the right place, towards policymakers. So, like I mentioned, a big focus of what we tried to do was working with, policymakers and policy team at Child Poverty Action Group, who are our project partners, to think, well, we've got these 400 and odd thousand words of people's experiences, but how can we then turn that into concrete policy asks? So, for example, we worked with some of the economists at Child Poverty Action Group to actually, put a cost on particular asks. So, for example, around, ensuring universality of like free school meals, for example, how much would that cost? And how much would that cost in relation to what's already been spent in the social security system? So we tried to say, from all different angles to try and appeal to policymakers. So we had, the economic costs, but then we had the lived experience as well to say, well, this is what it's actually like for someone living on low income. And, we tried to show people's experiences, not just in written form, but like I mentioned, in terms of, visually or in terms of audio. So it was about trying to get people's experiences shared in a policy context, but in all different ways. But like I mentioned in the talk, it's really difficult in terms of trying to think of, a huge policy shift, in terms of increasing universal credit payments by £50 a week, for example. We did a lot of work around trying to keep the £20 a week uplift that the government initially put in at the beginning of the pandemic for families receiving universal credit. Some families, we did a lot of work around, how can we push to keep that, and it did get extended for a few months, but then ultimately it didn't get rolled out overall, and it was in September 21 it was taken away from families. So it is really difficult to try and have an influence on policy, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. I think it's about being persistent and like I say, trying to manage expectations with participants.
Absolutely, and so important, isn't it, in terms of translating that into policy and actual changes in practice. Thank you, Kaylee. So back to Zubair again, and there's a couple of very popular questions, but as is the prerogative of the person with the power up here at the front, I'm going to choose this one. So does meditation have anything to do with brain improvement?
Very good question. So we all know that, as part of well-being, mindfulness, meditation and things like that does help some people. I have to say I'm on the fence with this. It doesn't help everybody. For example, I had sciatica a few years ago. My brother had sciatica too. He had acupuncture and he said it worked great for him. I had acupuncture, it didn't work for me. So it's up to the individual, essentially. It's up to your own expectations, but also your own mindset and stuff like that. We know that when it comes to brain injury, if you have a positive mental attitude, it does help. For example, athletes. There was one athlete that I know of who was spinally injured. He was an Ironman, and he had broken 10 of his spinal cord vertebrae. And so he had to have a 24-centimetre brace and screws in each of the vertebrae. But within a week, this chap was walking. Within a month, he was running again. Now, for you and I, that wouldn't be possible because we don't do that. But because of the fact that he was so determined to get back onto his feet and do this, you know, he was running within a month or so. Normally, for you and I, that would be 6 weeks bed rest, and then we might get the rehab and slowly get back into it, and then it might take us 3 to 4 months and up to a couple of years to get back to that sort of state. So it really depends on the mindset of the individual, whether something like meditation would work for you. And for some people, they swear by it. Yes, meditation does work, and it's just about mindfulness, essentially, at the end of the day. And if you have that positive attitude, you can make connections. We know that if you do something that makes you feel good, you release good hormones from your system, which can help healing. Things like stress hormones of cortisol, which most people might know. But if you release good hormones, even through exercise or something like that, you can counteract cortisol and you can reduce your stress levels. So this is why, you know, I'm a personal mentor for students. I always say, you know, don't just study, but also have something else that you do as a group, or because we are social beings at the end of the day. We need to have a social interaction with people. We need to see people, be around people, but also exercise as well. Because again, you know, releasing those good hormones are good for you and counteracts the negative effects that your mind gets into. Especially you know, prominent now with COVID, most of us being at home, we're isolated. A lot of us are having issues in terms of, you know, with our mental health and stuff like that. And if you ever do have something like that, meditation is really good. Just go outside and have some fresh air. It's brilliant for you. Go and exercise. I mean, with exercise, you release so many endorphins that it will make you feel a lot better afterwards.
Great answer, and actually I think we've heard quite a lot about the connections between physical, mental, natural and social sciences across the whole of our disciplines. Fascinating. Thank you so much, Zubair. Richard, really interesting question here, something I didn't know about. Has your research involved the wren's nest in Dudley?
It hasn't. So the Wren's Nest in Dudley is a famous geological site dating back to the Silurian. And at this point in time, you have to imagine the West Midlands is a bit more, and Dudley is a bit more like the Bahamas than today. So it's a tropical, beautiful, shallow sea with lots of corals and things like that. And lots of amazing fossils of corals and trilobites and so on were collected primarily in the 19th century. And you can see many of these in the Lapworth Museum of Geology here at the university. So this is long before dinosaurs. It's earlier in the geological record that I'm interested in, but we do have one of the world's best collections of Silurian fossils of this age here at the university. I'd encourage you to go and see them at the Lapworth Museum of Geology. They're a centrepiece of the display there. And it is also somewhere that we have traditionally taken our undergraduate geology and paleontology students as a core part of their first year here at the university. So it is very important to us, but it's not really somewhere that I'm actively involved in research. Certainly the university has done a lot of research on it in the past, but it's not really a personal focus for me.
Okay, thank you. That's good to hear there is an interest, though, as well. Thank you. So, Andrew, this is sort of picking up on a theme around transport. I know your favourite subject, so that's good. How do local and government strategies compare for transport resilience?
Now, that's a really good question. Okay, so the West Midlands has a West Midlands adaptation plan, which contains a lot of interesting different things. And we can certainly do an interesting analysis of how it speaks to adaptation and planning. In many cases, these plans are very generic, and this is not just the West Midlands, but in other places as well. And they often speak about the nature of the problem rather than how they will tackle the solution. So this is why I'm particularly focused on adaptation of engineering systems, as well as talking about carbon mitigation, because carbon mitigation gets an awful lot of press and is a very important thing to deal with. But I think that adaptation deserves an equal billing, because we might be able to change our carbon emissions, but we will definitely have to change our engineering systems for the future. So all of these plans are welcome. All of the development of these plans are welcome. But I think in terms of adaptation planning, we still have a lot further to go than we do with our mitigation planning. And so that's where it's really important, I think, to have an education focus on this and to raise the awareness of people as they come through places like the university here, to make sure that our students, so all of our student engineers, will learn about sustainability. They will learn about adaptation and climate change. They will build into their design projects as they work on a particular brief of coursework. They will be building into that specific elements of looking at what are the carbon emissions associated with it, how do we make it more resilient, how do we reuse materials within it rather than using new materials. All of these kind of things are part of the core curriculum that we now have in order to change the way in which engineers go out and think about problems that they solve in the world. And so in that way, hopefully the planning will come together with the skills and abilities of people who can actually deliver on those plans. And that, of course, is the really important part.
So the benefit of education moving forward in this area, thank you. Obviously important. And then Kaylee, which is in fact our last question we have today. Was there a prominent theme from your research that participants mentioned?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think if you have a look on the live archive of people's experiences, I think the top theme that comes out is actually around getting by. So that was the most coded theme. So just really the sort of everyday realities of what life was like for a person who was living on a low income with dependent children during the pandemic. So I think for people who were getting involved in the project, it was, well, they told us it was like quite cathartic to be able to share with us who were, you know, not known to them. We weren't a friend or family member. We were just, you know, a research team, being able to sort of share their experiences and offload in the diaries. And also people had an option when they did submit a diary. They could submit it for public viewing, or they could submit it to just us as researchers. So sometimes we would have people... was one poster, for example, at the beginning, she contributed around 25% of our content, but it was actually only just for our eyes only as researchers. So we would get these, you know, hugely long and detailed diary entries about, you know, how she was struggling with living as a single parent on her own during the pandemic. So she was just, for her, it was very much to be able to offload to someone who she didn't know. So I think that, like that very, just the act of being able to share, you know, how people were actually experiencing the everyday realities. And that was then fostered even more when we had the big ideas groups every month. So we tend to have about the same 25, 30 participants who would come along each week. And at the beginning, you know, on the Zoom, they would not have the camera on, or, you know, they were sort of quite shy. But then as time went along, people would start to put the cameras on, for example, and, you know, people would get to know each other. So then, you know, it really did form this sort of community of solidarity and sharing. So I think, yeah, interestingly, that was the most sort of coded theme. But then I think others that were really important were around, obviously, people's mental health and how that was impacted by, you know, by the pandemic, but also by actually living on a low income. So those were two of the sort of more prominent themes. But like I say, you can actually, we've got loads of different codes. If you go onto the live archive on the website, and you can just, you know, the ones that you're interested in, you can click on it, it'll pull up every single diary entry or video. So definitely say have a look at that.
Thank you so much, Kaylee. The importance of the lived experience in research of that nature too. Very sadly, that's all we have time for today. So thank you so much, everybody in the room, everybody online who's taken part and sent in questions. Please thank each of our panellists, Dr. Garthwaite, Professor Ahmed, Professor Butler and Professor Quinn. Thank you so much.